Welcome, everyone, to another fun edition of Indie Reads Aloud. As you all know, I love discovering new authors and their stories. And today we have a new author for me. Maybe you know him already, maybe you don't. His name is Joseph Schiller. Welcome, Joseph. I'm so glad you're here with me today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. All the way from Houston, Texas. That's pretty cool.
Yes, ma'am.
You Southern folks, I've had a couple of Southern men authors on the program lately, and it's a very odd thing for me to hear people call me ma'am. That's just weird because it's something we don't do in Michigan as a rule.
Okay.
It's a completely different culture, so it makes me feel like I might be in the military. So,
Well, I apologize.
oh no, it's fine. It's just one of those interesting differences in
Regional differences.
yeah, exactly. So it's kind of fun for me. Joseph Schiller is a high school social studies teacher in Houston, Texas, where he lives with his wife and 3 sons. The book he's going to read today, Upon the Arrival of Dawn, is his debut novel, and you tell me it took you about 10 years to write this book?
If yes, starting and stopping, life gets in the way sometimes, and so yeah, this was
Raising 3 children.
raising 3 children and all that, and so yes, about a 10-year journey for the
Wow.
first. Yeah.
Super fascinating. Well, I'm really interested to hear the story. Upon the Arrival of Dawn is a fantasy novel. Today's episode is going to be PG-13, so if you have younger ears, this is a program that they can listen to very comfortably. As darkness grows, threatening the delicate fabric of the universe, an ominous cloud spreads, bringing an increasing imbalance across the cosmos. Essences bent on wickedness and ultimate destruction are violently stripping the energy of life from innocent terrestrial creatures, bringing existence to the very brink of collapse. Only one ancestral essence boldly accepts the calling to seek out the source of the encroaching evil and restore harmony once again to existence. Azrael, humble servant of eternity, offspring of existence, will stop at nothing to protect the universe, mortal and immortal alike. I am so intrigued by this story description. And we'll talk about it a little bit after, but I'm really excited to hear you read. So when you're ready, please take the microphone and read aloud.
All right. Okay. So I will begin with chapter 1. The winter of one's life can be, and generally is, difficult to accept, especially when one is fully aware of just how quickly one's twilight is approaching, as is often the case in old age. The associated anxiety can be particularly acute if one is agonizing over how significantly afflicted they are in the body and mind, and therefore how accelerated their eventual deterioration shall be. Why is this thus? It is because death, as a state of or condition of being, is what ultimately defines mankind's mortality, determining man's terrestrial destiny. Wicked and righteous souls alike fear its gradual approach. Anyone that proclaims that they are prepared for the end of their corporeal existence is either deceiving themselves or is trying to fool others. Perhaps it is unfair for the benevolent, the righteous, to feel any trepidation. After all, they did try to live their lives in accordance with some commonly accepted sets of principles and values, cornerstones of a virtuous life. These individuals, if any beings at all, should be able to stare off into the beyond with stout hearts, possessing confidence that their post-terrestrial circumstance will be all they believed it could be. Nevertheless, they do not. For most, death's embrace is felt the same, regardless of one's individual merit, and that feeling is trepidation. coughed Cyril, in one of the increasingly frequent early morning spasms he had been having. If these spells would subside for even a moment, I might actually get a moment of peaceful slumber, he thought to himself in frustration. He was beginning to stir uncomfortably about his bed, clenching his fists around as much bedding as he could grab. The fits were becoming much more severe and persistent as of late, a source of growing concern. While Cyril is an older gentleman, until very recently, one might argue that he had enjoyed remarkably good health for a man of his advanced age. For the several weeks, though, for several weeks, though, he had been essentially confined to his bed, unable to shake a spell of something respiratory in nature. Cyril's condition began to change innocently enough, an early winter chill of sorts, but quickly progressed further into something much more serious. Bedridden, his physical state gradually worsened to the point that his family felt obliged to step in to tend to him full time. When the family's collective efforts to help him overcome his ailing condition failed, several physicians were dispatched to attempt to diagnose his treat him, all to no discernible avail. At the same time, the family, as is the wont of most of mankind when faced with similar circumstances, turned more of their attention toward a deity upon which they projected all of their collective hope, could or would intervene on their behalf and make their loved one whole once again. While hopeful, there were some members of Cyril's extended family who nevertheless began preparing for what seemed inevitable, their patriarch's passing. And so the family sought the presence of a man they believed could intercede spiritually. Mankind's view of its physical condition early in life seems often to be one of almost invincibility or infallibility. Death, however, tends to remind all of us just how truly fragile the nature of cellular organisms really are. Cyril's family could regrettably only sit in earnest vigil day and night while hoping desperately for signs that this situation would improve. Cyril's comfort was looked to with the utmost care and absolute dedication. No expenses or conveniences were spared in providing for what was increasingly expected to be the family elders' last days, or perhaps hours. If only everyone in such a state could be looked after with such unconditional outpouring of compassion and devotion. A man beloved by all that had the pleasure of knowing him, Cyril was, as would be considered by most, a good man. While he led, by all accounts, an unassuming and arguably ordinary life, he was at the same time virtuous and not without a sort of merit and humility. Cyril was not an overly recognizable figure within or without his community, any more than others of moderate success in life tend to be. As far as greater mankind is concerned, with acquiring more money and or possessions throughout life, he was by no means categorically wealthy. Nevertheless, he was, and it must be emphasized, more than respected by the few lucky enough to call him family, friend, and acquaintance. Prior to this most recent period in Cyril's life, of which this tale begins, Cyril was merely a humble clockmaker, constructing and repairing various timepieces in his small shop below the set of family apartments just a few paces from the center of the village. Certainly not a trade of any glamour or notoriety, but working hard, he was able to afford a sufficiently comfortable livelihood for his modestly sized family. Cyril was a good provider and a man adored by all. Now his family and friends were repaying his love and kindness in turn with their own adoration. Cyril's hacking subsided long enough to allow him to gradually breathe a bit more steadily, and with a little less effort, he slowly opened his eyelids and, with tremendous anguish, sat himself up in his bed. In his feeble condition, he usually required someone's assistance in order to move his fragile frame in any small way. He forced himself on this occasion out of a sudden sense of necessity. His numerous bed sores, a constant source of discomfort, were beginning to irritate him again, making the skin on his underside raw and sensitive to the touch. Gathering what little strength he could, Cyril propped himself up on his elbows. Gingerly rotating his head about, Cyril slowly scanned the modest room. He noticed a small bowl of food was set carefully upon the nightstand next to his bed chamber. By, by the appearance of its contents, it was some sort of porridge and had most likely been there for a while. Cyril knew his wife had been in to see him at some point earlier in the evening. The porridge by now had likely lost any aroma or flavor. Food was once such an indulgence, though now he was reduced to a largely liquid diet. In fact, he often had to force himself to consume whatever was prepared and act grateful for it. He stared at the bowl for several minutes, unable to decide whether he was desperate enough to try eating before being overcome once again with sluggishness. Fatigue often quickly evolved into drowsiness. Gently laying back down in bed, straining just as much as he had when he sat up, Cyril closed his eyes in an effort to return to sleep. In his heart, he said a quick prayer, asking in desperation for uninterrupted slumber, something he had not enjoyed for several weeks. He had just started to drift off when something startled him back to reality, believing that he had heard something faint, something akin to a soft voice, calling out in the darkness of his bedroom. Heart thumping almost out of his chest, he remained perfectly motionless, holding his breath as he best as he could, as he strained his ears for a hint of what had woken him. After several moments of no perceptible noise of any kind, Cyril felt convinced that he was in fact mistaken. After all, this old home always makes such unexplainable noises, Cyril thought to himself. It was possible that one of the many guests had recently visited had perhaps neglected to close a window before retiring from the bedroom. Slightly frustrated with the prospect of being kept up all night by the constant swishing and swaying from an evening breeze stirring the curtains about his bedchamber, Cyril closed his eyes once again with a renewed determination to get a few more hours of repose before something else jolted him awake. Those thoughts of rest had no sooner filled his mind than Cyril once again thought he heard the faint call penetrating the silence ever so slightly. This time, however, the voice seemed to be speaking his name as a gentle whisper into one's ears. With all the intensity that he could gather, Cyril listened for the voice to repeat itself. His mind and heart began to race once again, renewed with scattered thoughts. Was this perceived voice merely the imaginings of a sick man? He was never one that believed in ghosts or specters, but he found himself questioning how firmly he disbelieved. He was not disappointed when several seconds later, like the passing of a light spring breeze across one's face, and yet almost entirely imperceptible, Cyril was convinced that he unmistakably heard his own name called out to him from a yet undetermined corner within his room. Cyril, who's there? Cyril called out loudly as he could into the nothingness of the room, while nearly choking on his own words. He was beginning to perspire quite heavily, sweat beating across his brow, while his heart rate now began to race out of control within his frail frame. He tried again to calm himself down by attempting to convince himself that the voice he believed that he had heard was nothing more than nothing more than symptomatic of a senile old man in desperate need of rest. After all, he was extremely sick, and anyone in his particular condition could be forgiven for having periodic episodes of delirium. Yes, that is precisely what I am experiencing. These are simply hallucinations brought on by my weakened condition. My poor body is so tired. The sooner my eternal rest begins, the better, Cyril declared under his breath. His mind wandered for a few moments, the instantaneous and equally terrifying realization that there was something like a hand resting gently on his left shoulder brought him back. Who's there? He called out. Shivers immediately passed along his nerves. Fearing the move even a millimeter, he kept absolutely still for what seemed an eternity. A steadily rising heart rate and cold sweat returned with increased intensity. Finally, Cyril collected what little courage he had and painfully tilted his head ever so slightly towards his left side to look upon whoever or whatever had taken hold of his shoulder. His eyes, finally fully adjusted to the absence of light, rested on an unfamiliar personage positioned to his left, and Cyril's entire being froze in debilitating shock. Terror instantly overcame him in a recognition of the figure moving to sit next to him on his bed. Terror because he had an equally strong impression as to why this visitor was present. This state of paralysis lasted for what felt like forever to Cyril. He feared and refused to move, to blink, to breathe, or to even make a sound, wanting desperately to believe that he was in fact just dreaming. He tried to convince himself that at any moment something would at last stir him awake, that what he was experiencing was nothing more than a bad bout of hysteria. The personage's eyes, nevertheless, remained locked with his, neither set deviating from the other. It was the specter that finally penetrated the silence. You recognize me, do you not? Whispered the figure rhetorically with an almost inhuman voice. You know of me and have strong suspicions of precisely why I am here. Are you surprised? Despite the solicitation, Cyril made no effort to respond in any way to its prompt. While not being aware of exactly why, there was a strange and instinctive acknowledgement of this being lingering by his side. Consequently, he was beginning intuitively to recognize this mysterious guest's purpose for visiting, and therefore he remained resolved not to reply. It's perfectly understandable that you would resist responding, said the strange visitor, in an attempt to break the stalemate. The stranger looked upon Cyril with an almost gentle gaze, cocking his neck to the side slightly as he did. By doing so, you believe that you would ultimately be acknowledging my presence. And by answering, well, what do you hope what the outcome to be? As much as you would like to convince yourself that these sensations, both auditory and visual, are nothing more than the product of your weakened physical state, deep down in your core, you know that this is mere foolishness. Yes, I can read your thoughts and your feelings, as I can of all your kind. Cyril attempted to make out the full features of this personage. While he was unable to accurately discern anything for certain, he was able to catch some vague physical traits, yet he was unsure whether his eyes were betraying him. Nevertheless, the being sitting at his bedside appeared to be a relatively young man, though it was hard to estimate an age. From what Cyril could recognize, his lines were soft, calm, with an almost childlike innocence. In fact, his features had an almost disarming quality to them. Cyril stared at those eyes, gazing deeply into his. It did not matter that he could not see the specter clearly. He could feel the intensity in that gaze, could feel how the specter's eyes never lost their focus or even an instant. Yet he also sensed what seemed like a friendly enough grin. Although, or after a few seconds, when the mysterious figure was assured that Cyril was fully attentive, he continued, "Do you know why you recognize me?" "No." It came out as a stutter, betraying the persistent state of absolute terror Cyril had found himself in. "That is not entirely true, is it? You felt my presence the very instant I entered this room. Your energy flowing through you as familiar with mine as mine is with yours, as it is with the rest of your mortal brothers and sisters. For we are all part of the same creative force, are we not? Your spirit, if you will, recognize the presence of a force which, as it did mine, similarly created your existence," added the mysterious guest. The specter smiled at Cyril, almost warmly. "I am sensing a heightened anxiety within you. There is no need to feel such fear. Be at peace." There was a rather long pause before either said anything else. Cyril found it impossible to settle his heart and mind, though not without trying. Despite the strange visitor's admonishment to remain at peace, Cyril felt strongly that those were merely convenient words. Finally, Cyril gave in and ventured into a conversation with all the remaining bravery available within him. "Is this the end of my time?" With absolutely no hesitation, the voice of the specter replied in the affirmative. "Yes, though you already anticipated that I would answer as such." Suppose I did," Cyril said in a trembling tone of a man beginning to accept and in deep contemplation of his fate. "Cyril, try to settle your heart and your mind," suggested the specter. "Arrangements have all been made for you." At that moment, Cyril noticed the visitor's countenance begin to change, darkening and swelling like lengthening shadows. A sinister smile gradually formed across the visitor's face. Whatever lingering peace and calm Cyril previously had left in his heart quickly vanished and was replaced immediately with a renewed sense of anguish and horror. His first instinct was to use whatever fleeting strength he could muster to flee from his room in search of help or to call out to his family elsewhere within the home. His condition, however, was simply too fragile for any attempted outburst or escape. He found it equally as difficult to raise his voice much more than a whisper. Meanwhile, the personage just sat and watched him struggle, staring with an increasingly malicious look of enjoyment on his face. The stranger then slowly rose up from his sitting position on top of the bed and once again stood to Cyril's side. He then walked with great purpose toward the window, almost gliding as he did, before eventually taking a position at the front of the room facing out onto the empty street below. Pausing, the figure looked out into the dark of the night, almost as if he drew strength from it. He remained thus, peering out for several minutes in deep silence. Cyril himself was struck with fear to do anything to break that silence. It seemed that this being had been sent to escort his soul away to meet his maker. What he could not reconcile was why he felt so mortified instead of elated. While continuing to peer out the window, the terrible figure stated, "There are several questions you have chosen, as of yet, not to ask me. Perhaps you are afraid of the responses." It took Cyril a moment, but eventually he managed to choke out one of the questions lingering in his heart. Am I going to heaven or hell?" The guest in Cyril's bedchamber responded with a short cackle, a fiendish chuckle. Though brief, the laugh betrayed an intensely demonic nature. Countless ages have wrestled with such futile questions. Cyril was beginning to think his heart would give out just from talking to this terrible specter. Was that why the thing had come to visit, to hasten my demise? He shuddered, and the increasingly terrifying visitor laughed. He sensed that the terrible personage was deriving more pleasure from the heightened anxiety and fear. I have had you in my mind for some time, the stranger said. You led a life more than worthy of having the energy of your soul return to the source, the origins of all creation, or heaven, the thing corporeal beings commonly referred to as the afterlife. He gave another malevolent giggle while still maintaining his gaze out the window. However, I have other plans for your departing soul. Cyril was once again stunned, paralyzed even, with an indescribable fright. A darkness seized upon the deepest reaches of his heart. It took him several minutes to even marginally recover his faculties. Who are you? He asked, trembling and gasping uncontrollably at this point. Cyril was surprised when his visitor did not respond. He was about to repeat himself when he thought he heard a...
Swim team, please head to the bus on Capitol. Swim team, please head to the bus.
when he heard a sudden rushing sound from without the bedroom window, and the kind of noise made by a strong gust of autumn wind. A wind, from the sound of it, was fast approaching. Turning his ear ever so slightly toward the direction of the disturbance, Cyril now thought that perhaps the noise sounded not of a wind at all, but like the beating of 1,000 sets of wings, accompanied by an ever louder, unexplainable set of shrieks. The terror increased 1,000-fold. Suddenly, and without warning, the specter turned. Those intense eyes gleamed with malevolence as he coldly answered, I am the taker of souls. Without hesitation, the devilish form threw open the bedroom window in order to allow in a flood of demons, terrible spirits called keres, summoned for the purpose of devouring souls. At his bidding, the keres quickly went to work to rip Cyril's life energy from its mortal frame. His soul screamed out in tremendous and dreadful agony, a scream that reached every conceivable corner of time and space of creation. Silence soon prevailed. There were no discernible traces remaining of any activity in Cyril's apartment. None except for Cyril's cold and lifeless body lying in his bed. One might have mistaken him to be in a deep and permanent slumber, were it not for the terror of his final moments frozen in his lifeless face. The eyes staring at their tormentors, and the mouth agape in a silent outburst.
Wow, that was intense. Give me a sense of how you came up with the idea for this book. This was 10 years in the making. That's a really long time to play with theme and setting and character. What was the initial impulse that made you say, I want to write that story?
So this story was actually intended to be a short story initially. In fact, chapter 3, or what's now chapter 3 of the story, or the beginning of it, was meant to be that short story, and it was really just meant. I wanted to understand, or to play with the idea of what would it be like if, for an eternal essence, an angel of death, for example, how would they approach, or what mindset or perspective would they have on the theme of death, right? So I think most mortals kind of we collectively kind of have our own views on
Sure.
that transition between life and death, but I wanted to play on the idea of is what about what perspective would an eternal essence, and in this case, angel of death, that actually, and mythologically speaking, is the one who is involved in that transition. Where how do they come to
Yeah,
believe that, right?
it's like lifting the veil and seeing the other side.
And so it started as, again, it was going to be just the Azrael, angel of death, viewing the gradual passing of an individual and just his own being in his head. That was what it's supposed to have started off as. But as I began evolving that, I found that I liked that it was going beyond the short story, and I kind of started having some, well, what if we were to add this and add this, and next thing you know, I started, well, you know what, let's see where this goes, and
And
yeah,
today you have a novel.
I don't know.
It's very, very cool. I am so pleased that you were able to take some time and read for us today. I have added your books to my TBR, so thank you for that.
Perfect.
And I look forward to reading the rest of the story and seeing what happens next.
Very
I'm
good.
really grateful that you came today. I hope you had a good time.
No, I had a wonderful time. Anytime I
Awesome.
can read my story, anytime others that are interested will talk to me, and I'm very much appreciative of all you do for indie authors.
I'm happy to do it. And when you finish the next book, I hope you'll come back and read again for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Have an awesome day, sir.
You too. Thank you so much.